Hey guys, welcome or welcome back to The Final Feast. I'm Natasha Diamond. I'm interested in true crime, I love to bake, and they have a weird fascination with what convicts choose to eat as their last meal on death row. So that's what I do over here. I cook their last meal and I tell their story. All the recipes will be linked in the description box below, so if you want to try any of them out then just have a go and let me know what you think. Right, now let's turn up the heat on this cold-hearted killer, Earl Forrest. Now, this case is a wild one. It involves the murder of 3 people because of a dispute over, wait for it, a lawnmower. Yes, you heard me right, a dispute over a lawnmower. I don't really have much more to say in this intro, only like if you've borrowed some gardening tools off a neighbour or you've told someone you're going to get them a piece of gardening equipment, then just remember this case before you try to do them over. So for his last meal, I need to read it, it's a long one. Earl Forrest chose steak, pasta, a fruit plate, cucumbers, tomatoes, chocolate cake and a glass of milk. Not asking for much, was he? Now with the chocolate cake, I always find that they're either too dry or too rich in flavour. So I've made my favourite ever chocolate cake. This is called a Coca-Cola cake. Now hear me out, it does have Coca-Cola in the sponge and the icing, but you can't really taste it. It's got the right amount of sweetness and chocolatiness and it's just really delicious. So yeah, just try it out before you judge, okay? On the 9th of December 2002, Earl Forrest shot and killed his friend of over 30 years, 51-year-old Harriet Tottie Smith, her 41-year-old neighbour, Michael R. Wells, and 48-year-old Dent County Sheriff, Sharon Joanne Barnes. The tragic and preventable event all sparked from a dispute between Earl and his friend over a year prior regarding the purchase of a lawnmower. Let's go back to the beginning to find out who Earl was and what led to the tragedy that occurred on that fateful day. Earl Mitchell Forrest was born on the 12th of July 1948 in the USA. He had a difficult childhood and was regularly physically abused by his father. His extremely toxic father would also encourage his son to fight and was a keen supporter of alcohol and illegal drugs, which Earl got into at a young age. He began his life of crime selling marijuana and LSD in high school. As a young adult, Earl continued to abuse alcohol and lived a wild and dangerous biker lifestyle. He began selling harder drugs like speed and became known in the area as a meth kingpin, distributing all over the West Coast. Earl later compared his drug dealer lifestyle to like being a rock star. Although he never married, one of his ex-girlfriends, Nancy Young, said that Earl had a softer side to him. During their relationship, she had children from a previous partner, and Earl helped to raise them and acted as a father figure. He was also known for being a hard worker, but needed supervision to complete even basic tasks. In 1970, a then 21-year-old Earl bumped into an old friend he'd known from Boy Scouts at a supermarket. They got chatting and his friend asked Earl if he could buy a pound of weed off him. They arranged to meet back at Earl's house. It was there that Earl was introduced to his friend's then wife, Harriet Smith, who went by the name Tottie, a nickname she'd been given as a child by her father. Over the years, Earl and Tottie remained friends and she began buying methamphetamine off him to sell. He was living in California at the time, but had been in and out of prison from the age of 46 and wanted a change. Tottie lived out in a rural part of Missouri and she'd been sending Earl real estate brochures encouraging him to move up there. After his 4th release from prison, Earl decided to leave the drug world behind him and start afresh in Platte County, Missouri. Although happy about the move, Tottie wanted Earl to continue supplying her with drugs. Eventually, they came to an arrangement in which he hooked her up with a connection he had in California that she could source her methamphetamine from. In exchange for this, Tottie agreed to buy Earl a lawnmower and a mobile home. However, in the 2 TV interviews I watched with Earl, he never mentioned the mobile home and seemed more hung up on the lawnmower. At the time, he had a big garden and his ex-girlfriend had taken multiple items from his home whilst he was in prison, including the lawnmower. Tottie never honoured their agreement, instead kept making false promises and ignoring Earl's calls altogether. Nearly a year and a half later, the dishonoured agreement still weighed heavily in Earl's mind. He felt she was taking him for a fool and disrespecting him after he'd been there for her and helped her out when she'd needed it. On the morning of the 9th of December 2002, a then 53-year-old Earl woke up at 6:30 a.m, opened a bottle of bourbon and began drinking. He'd polished off the whole bottle within a few hours, so when his 21-year-old girlfriend, Angela Gamblin, showed up at his home, he was already intoxicated. The anger that had been brewing over this dispute with Totty was only exacerbated by the alcohol consumption. Earl later admitted that at this point he had started to lose it. Arming himself with a gun, he suggested to Angela that they go for a drive. Earl drove the two of them over to Totty's house with Angela in the passenger seat. They arrived at 10:45 a.m, but Angela waited in the car while Earl headed towards the front door. He noticed that Totty's car wasn't the only one parked outside, but also their mutual friend Mike's. This was unexpected, but didn't deter Earl in his drunken rage. Michael Arwell, better known as Mike, was Totty's 41-year-old neighbour. He worked at a local Walmart and would often play pool with Earl. He was a nice guy and was only round at Totty's to return a movie he'd borrowed. When Earl entered the property, he confronted Totty about the lawnmower, but her nonchalant response infuriated him further. When asked whether she was going to buy him one, she agreed that she would, but looked over to Mike, who was sitting on the sofa. Earl noticed her roll her eyes, as if palming him off yet again. At this point, Earl felt like he was being lied to and disrespected. To show he meant business, and to avoid having a witness, he shot Mike in his eye at point-blank range. He was killed instantly. In a panic, Totty called Earl crazy before bolting out the front door. Earl began firing shots at Totty, which she managed to avoid. Reaching Earl's car, she jumped into the driver's seat next to Angela, who was in shock. The car engine was still on, so Totty tried to reverse out of the driveway. Unfortunately, she hit something and the car got stuck. According to Angela, Earl approached Totty in a calm manner. He reassured her that everything would be alright, and they reminisced about old times, walking arm in arm back to the house. When inside the house, Earl made Totty show him and Angela her stash of drugs. She produced a lockbox from under her bed, which contained approximately $25,000 worth of methamphetamine. Earl stole the lockbox before shooting Totty a total of 6 times right there in her bedroom. The two then fled the scene, Angela driving this time. Unbeknown to them, a third person had been in that house that morning. Totty's boyfriend of 5 years, Eddie Starks, was in the back room when Earl had entered. As soon as he heard the raised voices and commotion, he was hesitant to leave the room. He knew that his girlfriend dealt meth and could hear enough to know that this was the reason for the altercation. When shots were fired, a terrified Eddie hid in the closet until the coast was clear. As Earl's car drove off into the distance and the house fell silent, Eddie felt safe enough to retreat from the closet. First, he came across Mike's lifeless body, laying still on the sofa. Then Totty in the bedroom in the same condition. The home was in a rural area, so Eddie had to run down the road to the nearest house, where he called for help. Eddie told the police he knew exactly who was responsible for the double murder. With all of the talk of lawnmowers and drugs, there was only one man it could be: Earl Forrest. As police secured off the crime scene and began their investigation, Dent County Sheriff Bob Wofford and Deputy Sharon Joanne Barnes headed to Earl's home in Platte County. At 11:28 a.m, Earl and Angela watched from the window as the sheriff's car pulled up outside. Sharon Barnes, who went by the name Joanne, walked ahead of Bob towards the front door. She'd crossed paths with Earl only a few years earlier when she'd arrested him for absconding parole in 1998. Earl persuaded Angela to answer the door while he prepared his gun and opened fire. Bob was able to return fire, but Joanne didn't get the chance to defend herself. She was shot in the head and abdomen and collapsed on the driveway. Joanne was well known and well liked around town. She was a kind and caring aunt to her nieces and nephews, and even described as the pillar of her rural community. Bob Wofford was able to take cover behind his police car, where he called for backup and medical assistance. He too had been hit in his abdomen, but fortunately his injury was not fatal. Within minutes, 7 law enforcement vehicles had arrived. Angela ended up getting shot in her side and was wailing for help. Earl was shot in the mouth and finally surrendered. He put some meth in his mouth, crawled to the front door and yelled, "I surrender. We need help. People down." When it came to trial, a jury only took 3 hours to reach a guilty verdict. On the 22nd of December 2004, Earl Forrest was convicted of 3 counts of first-degree murder and sentenced to death by lethal injection. Over his 13 years on death row, Earl showed a little remorse towards Mike and his family. Mike was an innocent bystander in the wrong place at the wrong time. As for his other 2 victims, this cold-hearted killer showed zero remorse, simply for the fact that Joanne was a cop and he blamed Totty for her own death after failing to keep her word. In 2005, whilst Earl Forrest sat in prison, he was linked to a decade-old unsolved murder. On the 5th of October 1995, a 39-year-old woman's body was found wrapped in a sheet and garbage bags. Bloody male clothing was found close to her body. It was believed at the time that these belonged to the perpetrator. The victim was identified as Laurie Beth Stephan, a mother to an 8-year-old girl. They were unable to confirm at the time how she had died. With no witnesses and a lack of evidence, the case went cold, but was reopened and under review for 18 months prior to being linked to Earl. At the time, any witnesses had been reluctant to talk as they were afraid of what Earl might do to them, but as time passed and with Earl's current incarceration, they felt in less danger. Investigators learned that Laurie was an acquaintance of Earl's and had been last seen riding her bike to his house. Police visited Earl in prison where he confessed to strangling Laurie to death. However, he never stood trial for this crime. On the 11th of May 2016, Earl Forrest was put to death by lethal injection at the state prison in Bonneterra, Missouri, Department of Corrections. He was 66 years old. He declined to give any last words, but witnesses say he mouthed something to his daughter, a reformed addict that he'd reconnected with whilst in prison. For his last meal, he ate steak, pasta, a fruit plate, cucumbers, tomatoes, chocolate cake, and a glass of milk. Thanks so much for watching. I'll be serving up more true crime next week, so if you've enjoyed this video, then please hit that like and subscribe button so you don't miss out. Until next time, enjoy every meal as if it was your last.